All right, we're going to start. Let me open in prayer. We'll kind of recap where we've been and then get moving here. Lord, we thank you for class this morning. Thank you for the sunshine. And Lord, I pray even this morning that as we remember in communion our fellowship with you, that we sing with joy and remember with gladness that you've called us into your family. And help us to see, Lord, pictures in the book of Judges and the warnings there as the failures of Israel become clearer. And we just, again, pray for your insight and wisdom this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we started into the book of Judges last week, and we only got 3 chapters in, which is just fine because part of it is, preparing for it, I realized how many strange things are in the book of Judges, so I don't mind slowing down a little bit and taking a look at them. So the first 3 chapters we got through last week really explain the cycle of the Judges. Part of the interpretation of Judges, and you see repeated over again, is that there's a cycle that takes place. Israel sins against the Lord. They fall away and they follow after the false gods. So they have a decline and a rebellion against God, walking away from his covenant and following after the nations. The reason is because they don't pursue clearing out the rest of the people after settling in the land. They get into the land, and God clears the land enough to have victory and to allow them to settle into the land. And then there was this continued action to take place that they would continue clearing out the land. And God said in the book of Joshua he wasn't going to do it quickly. He was going, otherwise, there would be other problems attached to it about following the Lord. And he wanted to test them. It really is a test. It's set up to test them whether or not they would follow the Lord. So God says, I'm not going to do it all very quickly because I'm going to leave the lingering problems over time. You'll learn to follow me. You'll learn to, trust me. And a part of the right. Can I help you? Yep. Yeah, come on in. I'll walk you down here. The Sunday school class, the normal one is here.
You want me to take her?
Yeah. Thanks, Susie. So in Judges, just to recap again, is that you have a cycle of disobedience to where God would bring, and he would use the nations as an instrument to be able to judge Israel. And so a part of the judgment was these nations would become a thorn in their side. And so that's part of the cycle of the Judges as we're reading through, and you see that, so that God causes them to cry out, right? The cycle goes, they cry out to God, and God sets up a judge to deliver them. And so these individuals that God chooses rise up and deliver Israel. They defeat the people who are oppressing them, and for a while they follow the Lord. And so in that cycle they fall again into disobedience. And so it goes right back to the beginning of disobedience. It's a circular cycle that for a while they follow the Lord, or it seems like they're following the Lord, but they follow right back into disobedience, and so it doesn't last. And that's what the picture of Judges is. And so our memory verse, right, in those days Israel had no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so the lack of leadership, the lack of following through with obedience is really illustrated in the book of Judges, and we made it through chapter 3. So at the end, after Ehud, and Barak, you get pictures of Shamgar. Again, nothing much said. He struck down 600 Philistines and saved Israel. We don't have any other details about him. So as you're reading through Judges, That's the picture that you get. Then you pick up into the northern campaign. Again, all of these instances in the book of Judges are localized. They're not throughout the whole nation of Israel, and so they happen in local areas. Part of the problem that you'll see is that in Judges, you have certain tribes fall into disobedience, and a part of their disobedience is they don't work together with the other tribes. They don't take care of each other and love each other. So a part of that is you'll see that come out at times too.
Also, ask about Deborah, but do you want to get to explain it first, or can I just ask my question?
You can ask your question and then I'll tell you.
So a lot of the charismatic, they made a big deal about Deborah, that she was a leader, prophet, whatever. What is your take? She was a prophet, that's what it said.
Yep.
That was it.
She was a prophet. She was used by God. She was called to judge.
Right.
So God, I think, recognizes her as the judge, right? So I have no problem with that. Does it indicate a lack of leadership in Israel? It still does, right? Should it have been males who were leading? I think you'll see that that's true.
That was my question, okay.
So she'll rebuke, what's his name? We'll get there. Barak, yeah. Barak, yeah. So that she gives a little rebuke to him to say, you know what, I got to do this because you won't, right? But at the same time, there's no problem with her doing it. I don't think there's any, shame or disgrace in anything she does.
Any of God's laws or anything like that.
She's super wise.
Right.
No problem with her, yeah. So I don't look at that as like she shouldn't have been doing it. She absolutely should have been doing it, and God raises her up to do it. So we'll get into it. And yeah, I don't have any issue with it. Is it normative? No.
No, okay. So it doesn't,
Does it give a reason for women pastors? No.
Okay.
I'll follow to your logical conclusion. No. Does it give lots of opportunities for women to do lots of things, and absolutely opens up opportunities for, and shows that women can do lots of things for the Lord, and they're not restricted, and they're not, except for the few biblical restrictions of pastors and elders, right? Other than that, go for it. So yeah, I think that she's a good example, and one that should encourage women to get up and do.
Except for we can't say, because people say, well, because Deborah was a prophetess nowadays.
Yeah.
I can be a prophetess, or I can be whatever.
Sure.
Yeah, but that was just a specific.
You want to be careful now. When you say something wrong, should we follow through with the laws of the prophets?
Yeah.
And kill you?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd want to claim to be a prophet.
Yeah.
Just to add on, you made me think about how in the New Testament, I think it's 6 daughters of Philip are prophetess.
Yep.
So,
Correct.
God, obviously has used for men and women within His kingdom.
Absolutely.
So,
Lydia, seller of purple.
Yeah.
There's lots of women in the church who did lots of things. Absolutely. So yeah, and there are occasions for women to do everything except be pastors and elders. And that's an authority issue, that God has a creation order to things, and that's what it's attached to. So without getting too far into it. So part of it, Deborah is a good example. So we'll get into Deborah, and I don't know if we'll even get past it, but we'll see. We're moving slow, but that's okay, because this is the one book I want to kind of take my time in and examine. So again, we've got God's grace on left-handed people. We've got God's grace on women. We've got God's grace on people who are sons of prostitutes. And, God uses all kinds of people in this book to do all kinds of things. There's grace and mercy all throughout the book.
Okay, one last question. Does that justify women today being a prophet, or standing up in service? I'm almost sure I know the answer, but...
So I would tend to say no on that. Now, being a prophet in the New Testament is different than being a prophet in the Old Testament. And being a prophet, even like the daughters of Philip, it's too big a discussion to get into, but there are distinctions. New Testament's a little different, and I don't have time to go into it. But yeah, sometime we could do it. But yeah, I think that prophets right now, you don't really have an office of prophet that exists in the church. I have reasons why I believe that, but we can get into it some other time. Yeah.
For man or woman?
No.
Just say, okay.
No.
Okay. Yeah.
What's there against left-handed people?
It's a joke from the last time because Ehud was a left-handed guy who raised up as a judge, and God uses his left-handedness as a way to deliver Israel. He actually does. Go back and read it. But it's somewhat sarcastic. I'm trying to crack it a joke. But yeah. No, he was a man who was left-handed, and God used it to deliver Israel, actually. So it's a good thing. It's just some places they say, oh, if you're left-handed, they try to make you right-handed. Don't do that. Let people be left-handed. So it's a joke, but good question. So those are the things I want to get to because you got to understand it when you come up to them. So, but now Deborah. So Judges chapter 4. This is the cycle that begins, and we've seen it already several times. Chapter 4 and verse 1 says, the sons of Israel again did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and Ehud died. And so Ehud, who was the judge at the time, God delivers Israel for his whole life. It doesn't mean they obeyed him his whole life. It doesn't mean that they were walking faithfully through his whole life. God had already set up the stipulation that when I set up a judge and deliver you, you'll have peace the life of that judge. So however many years he lives, could be 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, right? However long that judge lives. And so that's what happens here, is that when Ehud dies, God's ready to bring the cycle back in. They could have been already falling away. They could have already been disobedient because they were already doing what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. Okay? So culturally, like as a society, Israel gets delivered, they have some peace, and it's a downward until that judge dies, and then God sets up the next oppression. And that's what happens in verse 2. It says, Yahweh sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, right? So you have this picture of this new oppression that takes place in verse 2. He reigned in Hazor, and commander of his armies was Sisera, and he lived, right? And so verse 3, the sons of Israel cried to Yahweh, for he had 900 iron chariots, and he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. So remember, we talked about the length of time, right? It's not always you add the chronology up, some of them overlap, but you're getting, 20 years, 80 years, 100, we're getting now, hundreds of years into the nation of Israel after settling into the land. And so they have this oppression by this king who has 900 iron chariots that they never finished clearing out, and, or he builds back up, and now he's oppressing them. And so it says in verse 4, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. And so she rises up as a judge. And so she's leading Israel. And it doesn't mean that, like, in a one-day period, she rises up as a judge and immediately they're kicking this guy's butt and kicking him out of the land. It doesn't quite happen that way. It takes a little time. But she rises up as a judge. And a part of it is, this is her description and character, says she used to sit under the palm trees of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel came to her for judgment. So they used to come to her and recognize her leadership and ask her for wisdom in decision making.
There's like a whole section that I wish God had written about, because how it's such a male-oriented society, and it just says, next sentence, she's a judge.
Yep.
How did it happen? What was her characteristics? How did God orchestrate it? For that to take place.
Correct.
It's not written. It would be really interesting to read.
Yep. I mean, I think it certainly indicates a lack of male leadership, which is their problem. It allows for her to rise up and do what she does, which she's not criticized for, rightly so. That she does this is never her problem, right? And, I don't think it's normative, but it does, you have to use wisdom and decide when you're going to do what you do, right? Here in this instance, you got to imagine how bad is it that she's doing this, okay? And God raises her up partly as a rebuke too, right? A rebuke to some of the men, as we'll see, that she'll rebuke them. And but again, she's doing what God wants. She's doing what God has called her to do. And there's a lot you could say. There's a lot you wish we knew because we wish we could make it clearer. but it just says that's what she did, right? So there was a period of time of days, months, years, I don't know, but that she was doing this and leading Israel, and specifically it gives the regions, right? It says she used to, and Ephraim and Judah, right? So Ephraim, the hill country, this is the area around Jerusalem, the hill country, the rolling hills around Jerusalem, where Ephraim existed. This is the tribe that's in focus in verse 5. And then in verse 6 it says, Then she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh, Naphtali, and said to him, Has not Yahweh, the God of Israel, commanded, Go forth and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun? Right? So now you have this is a tribal interaction. This is a tribal. She's in Ephraim. She's talking to two other areas in Israel, Naphtali and, my brain goes, and Zebulun. And she's saying something we don't know, but she brings us in. God had already told them what to do, right? So the fact that she's reminding them, hey, didn't God tell you to take 10,000 men up and go deal with this? What are you waiting for? Meaning he should have already been doing it. Okay? The problem statement is that Barak, in verse 6, already had word from the Lord that he should go up and deliver Israel with 10,000 men and clear out this oppression. And the indication is he hadn't been doing it. Hadn't started yet. What are you waiting for? Get going. Okay? So, her solution in verse 7 is this. Has not the Lord commanded this? Go and take Naphtali from the sons of Zebulun, and I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, the chariots and many troops, and I will give them into your hand. Verse 8, the problem is Barak says, well, if you go with me, I'll go do it. Right? And God already tell you to go do it? Well, if you stand up and lead me, I'll go do it. So Barak's not too great on leadership skills here. He's looking to Deborah. She's already recognized as a leader, a judge, a decision maker, influential, right? Political in that sense. Now he's saying, well, if you could just lead the army here, that'd be great. Grab a sword. Yeah.
I see a parallel here. Apparently Joshua was very old.
Oh, yeah.
Very old. In our country, Washington, the general, became the first president. And there they didn't have an old. He was young enough to be able to take over.
Yeah.
But there they didn't, because Joshua was very old.
Yeah, and at this point he had died. So actually at this point he had died already. But he was very old. He led them until he was very old and died. Yeah. So at this point there are no leaders like this. Nobody took over for Joshua. And so what you have is they're divided into like counties or states, all the different tribes, right? Here in Ephraim and Naphtali and Zebulun, they have this problem of oppression that nobody's leading. God delivers them and he says, well, I'm going to appoint Barak to go out and lead this army. And he knows that. And then he's got to wait till Deborah calls him out and says, dude, you were supposed to already have this done. What are you waiting for? He said, yeah, it's kind of scary. I'd rather have you leading us. I'll go if you go.
Quick question: why do you think God allowed that to happen? I mean, because Moses, I don't know if he picked Joshua or not, but Moses knew Joshua would be following him. So why? Is it because they didn't pray about it, or
he wanted to test them? Like the beginning in the first few chapters says, look, God's going to test us, and a part of it is we're looking at this and going, there's still something that doesn't sit quite right with this whole situation. That, like you said, you don't get all the info, right? But what you have to kind of assume is that you're looking at the culture around this and going, all right, if people who are at least trying to follow God or have some knowledge of God, they're trying to figure out what to do, but he's still willing to let this, a lady lead an army? Like, I get that she's judging and that's cool, but do you really want her to strap on a sword and lead the army? Is that what you're saying? Like, there's something wrong with that, right? Like, that's no criticism on her. That's a problem with Barak going, she's doing what she's supposed to do. You're supposed to go do what you're supposed to do. You should both be doing what God wants you to do, and now you're saying, I want you to do my job too, right? So the problem is there that, I don't think a lady should necessarily pick up the military, right? So there's a problem there. But that's his weakness. And so if that's what the people who are trying to follow God are like, what are the rest of the culture around them? How far have they sunk? They don't got no problem with any of this. They're whatever, right? They're probably, anything goes, right? So the people in these tribes, they're not following the Lord. They're crying out. They don't have any instruction. They don't know the law. They're not being, they're not going to church. They're not being taught, right? They don't know anything. And here, that's where in verse 8, when it says, if you go with me, I will go, but if you do not go with me, I will not go. That's a problem. Yeah. Okay? That's a problem on Barak. So she says in verse 9, right? This, right? Verse 9, so she said, I will surely go with you, nevertheless the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for Yahweh will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Okay? So she's like, yeah, I'm going to go, but you're going to be shamed in this whole thing, right? You're not going to get any of the glory for this, which implies that if he had just obeyed God, if he had just gone and done what God had asked him to do, God would have lifted him up as a leader, would have recognized his obedience, and he would have had the glory for it, right? But because he doesn't, she's saying, glory's going to go to a woman now. I'm going to do it. And you ain't going to get nothing. You lose. You're going to lose out of it. You'll have victory, but nobody's going to think it was you. You're not going to have the leadership you should have, the recognition you should have for being obedient, right? So she's going to lead him by the nose. I'm going to go up and do what I'm supposed to, what you're supposed to do. And that's her rebuke to him, right, in verse 9. So you have that rebuke. And so Deborah arose and went with Barak, right? She went with him. So you have that whole progression that takes place. And then verse 10 says, Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali together to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up. So they get the 10,000 people from those two tribes that they're supposed to get. They go up and they follow, right? Kind of skip to verse 14 and just look at another statement there. For time's sake, it says, Deborah said to Barak, now arise, for this day in which Yahweh has given Sisera into your hand, has not Yahweh gone out before you? Right? So this whole strategy of how they're doing this, and that Barak, now it's a feint, right? Barak is driving out the main force. Deborah's going to lead a flanking maneuver and kind of set up a trap is what is happening. Now she says, get out there and be the bait. Get out there and be the bait, right? Get up and arise and go do this. So she's even giving them the plan of how it's going to go. So Barak went down and he does this with 10,000 men, right? And they think the chariots are going to win the day. That's how it goes, right? So it's a military thing that's kind of set up, if you read all the details, of a flanking maneuver where Deborah's going to jump out and with the remaining part of the army and win the day. And that's what happens. And so it says, verse 15, Yahweh threw Sisera and all his chariots and his camp into confusion with the edge of the sword before Barak. Sisera came down from his chariot and fled away on foot, but Barak pursued the chariots and all those in the camp as far as, Harshabeth. Yeah, you can pronounce that one. That's too hard for me. And the camp at Sisera fell by the edge of the sword, not even one remained, right? So you have this victory that's delivered by Deborah's wisdom. She sets up the military maneuvers. She tells them when to go out and fight. She sets up kind of a flanking maneuver that wins the day with the chariots. And that's kind of how the battle goes for Deborah. So verse 17, it says, Sisera fled away on foot, right? They give this little extra detail. And he fled to the wife of Jael, the wife of Heber, the Kenite, for there was peace between the houses, right? I got a safe house to go to, says the king, right? This is how it takes place. Now here's the second rebuke for them, right? You read the whole thing and it goes out and it talks about how she goes into the house and she says in verse 18, turn aside, my master, do not be afraid, I'm going to hide you. I'm going to hide you real good. So she covers him up and hides him and all that. And she says, gave him water to drink and covered him up in verse 19 and verse 20 and 21. That's where she took the tent peg and the hammer and drove it into his skull, right? And while he was hidden. And she delivers him up to, as the Lord uses another woman to deliver Israel, right? Nobody else was doing it. So God uses Deborah, and he uses Jael, the wife of Heber, to deliver Israel, doing things they should not have to be doing because no one else would do them, right? And so the women stand up and they win the day. That's this picture of Deborah, right? So you get this picture of Deborah in chapter 4 of delivering with Jael, the wife of Heber, delivering Israel. So it goes in and you have the song of victory, right? The song of victory comes out and they sing this song in chapter 5, in which I'll just draw out a few highlights. It says in verse 15 of this song, it says, "The princes of Issachar were with Deborah, and as was Issachar, and so was Barak. Into the valley they rushed," right? So part of the song is they're going, well, who was leading all the men? Who was leading all this army? Deborah was leading this army. And a part of that she draws out. In verse 16, the question is asked, "Why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the whistling of the flocks among the divisions of Reuben? They were great probings of the heart. Gilead dwelt across the Jordan. Why did Dan stay in ships? Asher at the seashore and dwelt by its landings." This is a rebuke of the tribes who didn't help. You guys are all sitting over by the coast while we're getting hammered here in the hill country, and you guys didn't come and help. So you have a rebuke that kind of takes place in the whole song about the other tribes not helping. A part of the problem of the time of the judges, no leadership, they don't always help each other. So they get some rebuke in the matter. And then in verse 31, it kind of wraps up, and it says, "Thus all your enemies perish, O Yahweh, but let those who love him be like the rising of the sun." And the land was quiet for 40 years. And that's, as much as we know about the time when Deborah was around, right? I think the two important, the rebukes are that there was no male leadership that should have rose up and did what they were supposed to do, militarily especially. And then you have the two women who rise up and do the dirty work. So they did it. They were obedient to God. And there's no rebuke for that. They should not be. So, again, it's not normative, but in a time of crisis, in a time of downfall, when this happens, then you got to recognize when God is making it move, right? So that's, any questions on Deborah?
No, but I think it's such an encouragement, like stories in the Bible, empowering women, so to speak. Like, I have family members on my husband's side. They're very feminist, and I don't think they've ever read the Bible, but they very much have a view, I feel like, that Christianity is chauvinistic, oppressive towards women. But when you read these stories, like how Moses gave the tribe of Manasseh, the man that only had daughters, he gave them an inheritance.
Yes.
He's using these women, Deborah and Jael, and even throughout the stories, like Rahab, and so many women of the Bible are used by God and precious in God's sight, and it's just a reminder to me that men and women, although different, are equal, and we have different gifts and abilities, and they're made differently, but they are equally important in the sight of God.
Yeah, and they have great things to do, and I agree. I think it is encouraging. So I don't know how far we'll get into Gideon here, but we'll take a look at another cycle of Judges in chapter 6. And so as you get into the central campaign, central in the sense of the nation of Israel, they call the central campaign from chapter 6 through 10 because it happens along the Jordan River. Okay, kind of takes place on both sides of the Jordan River. And there's a little problem with who's helping who in this one too. So do the people on the other side of the Jordan come and help in this one? They don't really, and then there's problems, and you'll see it. But again, the tribes are supposed to help each other, and in this one they don't. So it's another point to highlight. So Gideon was a judge. God raises up Gideon in chapter 6 with the oppression of the Midianites. And so chapter 6 and verse 1, it says, the sons of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. Copy, paste, right? Yahweh gave them into the hands of Midian for 7 years. And the power of Midian prevailed against Israel because of the Midian. The sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. They ran into the mountains and hid in caves. So Midian comes and oppresses here in this middle area of Israel. They run up into the hills and caves and hide in the caves from them. That's our solution. So that's how bad the oppression was too, right? And it says that when Israel had sown, in verse 3, that the Midianites would go up with the Amalekites and the sons of the east and go up against them. And they would camp against them and ruin the produce of the earth as far as Gaza. So you're familiar with modern day events happening in Israel. Gaza's along the coast. They went from the Jordan River and they pushed all the way to the coast and ruined all the crops. They were running around taking all the crops and then leaving ruins behind, giving no food for Israel. Taking away their food, right? I mean, hunger is a real big crisis when you have wars. We know that today. That's one of the biggest problems with the war over there is hunger, right? People are starving. They can't get food to them. And so you see that today. It was the same at the time of Gideon, right? The war was taking place and it caused a famine, a severe food shortage to take place because of the armies coming through and wrecking all the crops. Right? They couldn't grow anything because they kept wrecking the fields that the crops were in. They couldn't ever start a process of growing in the fields. And so that's a problem with this particular one is how it went. It says in verse 4, they would camp against them and ruin the produce of the earth as far as Gaza and leave no sustenance in Israel, as well as no sheep or ox or donkey. They didn't even have the tools for plowing. Couldn't hook it up to a donkey or an ox to plow. They took all of the animals. So now you don't have your, it's like taking your tractor today, right? They have nothing to plow with. So, big problem in Israel. And so, tracking along in verse 6, it says, Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried to the Lord. So there's your cycle of the judges that is taking place. And it says that they cried out. And it happened that when the sons of Israel cried out in verse 7 on account of Midian, that Yahweh sent a prophet to the sons of Israel. And he said to them, Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, It was I who brought you up from Egypt, and I brought you out from the house of slavery, and I delivered you from the hands of the Egyptians, and from the hands of all your oppressors, and drove them out before you, and I gave you their land. So in verse 10 he says, Now I am Yahweh your God, and you shall not fear the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But you have not listened to my voice. You went in there and you cowered, and you're afraid of their gods, and you're afraid of these people, when you shouldn't have to be, because of your disobedience. Because not only have you been morally disobedient, but the biggest moral problem is you don't listen with obedience to when God tells you what to do. Right? You act in fear. And so he says, that's why all these things are happening. I just want to be clear, these things are happening because you haven't obeyed. I want to be clear, you know better because you've seen everything that I can do. You've heard and been taught how I've delivered your people, and you don't listen. So he's giving this extra detail in this one, right? That he actually sends a prophet to tell him what the problem is. He does, right? So that's where you get to in verse 11. It says, And the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, and his son was Gideon. He was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to preserve it from the Midianites. So he's kind of hiding this process of making food. He's beating out wheat in the winepress. Why? That you wouldn't expect him to do that. You wouldn't look for him there. trying to hide it and cover it up and make sure they can get enough food before the Midianites come and take it. So he's got this process of, trying to hide the process of beating out the wheat. That's what I really see there. Trying to do these things. The people had already learned how to try to hide their food because they're afraid they're going to come and have it taken from them. So that's where the Lord, and now the Lord here, when it says the angel of Yahweh came and sat under the oak, right? That's a pretty specific designation. As this not just an angel, but an angel, right? This is the messenger of Yahweh, the angel of Yahweh. And the angel of Yahweh in verse 12 appeared to him and said to him, Yahweh is with you, O mighty man of valor. Then Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if Yahweh is with us, then why has all this happened to us? And where are all his wondrous deeds which our fathers recounted to us, saying, Did not Yahweh bring us up from Egypt? But now Yahweh has abandoned us and given us into the hands of Midian. Verse 14, Then Yahweh turned to him and said, Go in this strength of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? So you have this first person designation there that's pretty clear. The angel of Yahweh says, I sent you. Has not the Lord sent you? Has not God sent you? Have not I sent you? So I look at this as captain of the Lord of hosts, the angel of Yahweh, probably a pre-incarnate Christ. It's a pretty good indication that this is God who is speaking to Gideon when he uses that first person. So, in verse 15, he says, O Lord, with what shall I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the smallest, the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. But Yahweh said to him, Surely I will be with you, and you shall strike down Midian as one man. So you have this whole dialogue that's taking place, and how he's going to deliver them, right? And that's verse 16. So then you have this series of testing that takes place with Gideon, right? Gideon goes and he provides this testing. He says, if I have found favor in your eyes, then do a sign for me that it is you who speak with me, you, God. Please do not depart from here until I come back to you and I bring out my offering. I'm not sure that you're God. I'm not sure that, I want to make sure. And I don't advise testing the way Gideon did. I don't think that's the normative either. Again, some of the churches, they want to make that normal. I wouldn't make that normal, right? Yeah. If you do, then you have to expect that God's going to test you the way he tested Gideon and probably teach you a lesson in the whole matter. Don't put the Lord to the test. Mm-hmm. So Gideon doesn't get blessed for his testing of the Lord. He gets kind of humbled by it, right? Say, you shouldn't have done that. Now I'm going to teach you a lesson, right? So don't make it the normal the way some people do. So you have this whole thing that Gideon says, I want to come back and I want to offer up this offering and then, take the meat, and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock. So the angel of God, tells him what to do about it. And the angel of Yahweh put out the end of his staff and touched the meat. And fire sprang up from the rock, right? The angel of Yahweh went away. So this is what he says in verse 22. 22 is that he says, Alas, O Lord Yahweh, for I have seen the angel of Yahweh face to face. This was an encounter with God, face to face. That's why I believe this is, again, a pre-incarnate Christ. I believe this is how in the New Testament when it says you look back and see Christ, this is one of them. So, right? So you have this testing that takes place with Gideon, and he does the series with the fleece, and is it wet or not wet, right? I don't get much into that here as far as, how it goes. But after he realizes what happens, and he realizes, oh no, I was just talking to God face to face. Here's the encouragement. Peace to you. Do not fear. You're not going to die because you talked to me face to face, right? Imagine this. You're going to talk to the Lord face to face. The problem is I'm a sinner and I'm doomed. I just kind of smart-mouthed the Lord a little bit, right? I sassed him a little bit here. I'm in trouble. And so God says, Peace, do not fear, you will not die. And we'll get through the altar, I think, here. So it says, right away, Gideon built an altar there to Yahweh and named it Yahweh is Peace. Thank God he didn't kill me. I'm building an altar. God is peace. And so he builds the altar, and he says that the same night he's building this altar, verse 25, says the same night, I'm just tracking, I don't have my clicker, I forgot to put batteries in it. So, happened in the same night that Yahweh said to him, take your father's bull and a second bull, 7 years old, pull down the altar of Baal, which belongs to your father, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it. So you have an altar that would be built, and not according to the instructions of Yahweh, right? God had a very specific way he wanted his altar built. This is the wrong one. And there's an Asherah pole next to it. So Baal and Asherah are the two main gods of fertility and providence that they would have worshipped in these Canaanite areas. And again, there were sexual immorality involved with the worship of them. That's especially the Asherah pole and everything. And so that's a big problem. And he says, I want you to take your dad's bulls, take 2 of them, go down, hook them up to it, strap them up to this thing, and knock it all down. Right? Again, that's their tractor version. You're going to take them, strap it to this thing, and knock them down. Pull them down with the bulls. Right? So they're big enough. You need a couple of bulls to pull this thing down, right? It's a high place. It's a worship area for these people. God says, go up there and knock it all down, okay? So then he says, and then I want you in verse 26 to build up an altar to Yahweh your God on top of this stronghold in an orderly manner, that is according to the instructions, right? Don't smooth out your stones and everything like you're not supposed to do. Build it the way I want you to build it. And he says, and then I want you to then take the second bull and offer a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah pole, chop that thing up and use it for kindling, and burn that bull to me. Right? So you're taking it and you're building an altar according to the instructions. It's not exactly the way you should do it, but he's saying, I want you to do it on top of their false worship, build this thing, use the remains of their false worship, and burn it up to me with this bull. So Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as Yahweh had spoken to him. And it happened because he was too afraid of his father's household and the men of the city to do it by day, he did it by night. So it's like a bunch of high school kids running out and, pranking some, high school prank. They do this thing at night, get away with it, and don't tell nobody, right? We'll do it at night. The implication is God said, you can just do it during the daytime. Ain't no problem here. I'm in charge, right? Rather, Gideon, because of his fear, makes the choice to do it by night and don't tell no one. So verse 28, it says, the men of the city arose early in the morning, and behold, the altar of Baal was torn down, and the Asherah which was beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered, and they see all the debris. They see the second bull was offered, and they said, who did this thing? In verse 29, they searched out and inquired, and because you never get away with anything, everybody knows, well, it was Gideon. Right? It's Gideon. And so Gideon, the son of Joash, did this thing. Verse 30, the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son that he may die. For he has torn down the altar of Baal, and indeed he has cut down the Asherah which he has beside it. So now Gideon's in trouble with the police. Gideon, with the culture here, the people, the men of the town said, it's time to lynch him because he did this thing. He's going to die. And the wisdom here and rebuke is this, in verse 31. It's great. One of my favorites in the book here of Judges. Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal? Or will you save him? Right? Where's Baal in all this thing? Whoever will contend for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because someone has torn down his altar. Why do you guys get up and deal with this? If Baal is a god, let him come and deal with himself. Right? If Baal is a real god, let's wait for him to come down and kill Gideon. He can deal with Gideon. Right? Therefore, on that day, Gideon's name was changed to Jerubbaal. That is, translated, let Baal contend against him, because he had torn down his altar. So now he gets a name that mocks the god Baal. Right? Gideon, your name is now, he's the guy who went against Baal. Baal can fight with him Baal can fight with him if he wants. And they change his name, and his name becomes Jerubbaal. And so all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the sons of the east assembled themselves, and they figured, you know what we're going to do? We're not going to go against Gideon. We're going to go against the whole of Israel. It's time to wipe them out. We're so upset about this that you're right. We'll leave Gideon alone, but we're going to go after all of Israel because now you've shamed us and embarrassed us in this whole matter, and we're going to assemble an army and fight against. And we'll break there. We're going to get ready for the service. It's time, so we'll pick up with Gideon and finish that off and continue in Judges. In a few weeks we'll get through Judges. You see how slow we're going, so again, I'm okay with it.